Kuniholm, Chair of Fair Districts, Pennsylvania. What is the process we call redistricting?
Redistricting is the redrawing of legislative voting maps after the census. So every 10 years, it has to happen by law. Sometimes people hear about it and they say, well, just don't do it. By law, it has to be done every 10 years after the census to keep legislative voting districts fairly even in population. And that means the state House, state Senate, and also our state congressional House of Representative districts also get redrawn every 10 years. That's redistricting.
How are the borders of the legislative districts determined then? And after all, this practice goes back a while, doesn't it?
Well, it actually goes back to the 1960s. Before that, states, whenever they felt like it, they did it. And there was a major court case with the Supreme Court in the 60s that said this needs to be redone every 10 years after the census, because some states never got around to it. So you had huge districts with huge population, districts with very small population, very uneven in terms of how your vote was valued. So after the Supreme Court case, I believe it was 1967, it had to be redone. Pennsylvania had a state constitutional convention where this was put into the state constitution for state House and Senate, and that was done in the late 60s. So state House and Senate are done by a 5-person commission, which is the majority and minority leaders from the House and Senate. In the Constitution, it says the 4 of them will then choose a commissioner to be the chair, the fifth commissioner who would be the chair. They've never agreed on that person. So if they can't agree, then the state Supreme Court chooses that person, and every decade the state Supreme Court has chosen that person. Congressional districts are done differently. They are done as a bill, and so it's simply a bill. It gets introduced in a committee, it gets passed as a bill, it goes to the governor. If it's all one party, they can really do some special things to keep their party in control. If it's divided government, not so much, but it is simply a bill, gets passed, goes to the governor, gets signed. If that doesn't happen, though, sometimes the courts get involved, which is what happened this last time.
As they did in recent history. But let's take a step back in our discussion and just consider what I'm going to call redistricting 101.
Sure.
What are the criteria for redrawing the legislative maps?
Well, so for the state House and Senate, the state constitution says they need to be compact, which means not sprawling all over. They need to be contiguous, which means all parts need to be connected to each other. And they should divide municipalities, counties, wards as little as possible. That instruction has pretty much been ignored for the decades since that was put in the Constitution. The congressional districts, there's really no rules at all, except that the courts have said they need to be as close to equal in population, which has been interpreted to be one, to the person, like zero deviation between districts. That's not the case for House and Senate. They have larger deviations, but there are no other rules at present for congressional districts.
So what determines the size of any district map?
They take the population. The census counts the population every 10 years. The years ending in 0 is the national census. And then the Congress divides the population. There's 453 congressional districts. Those get divided among the states. So some states lose a seat, some states gain a seat. Pennsylvania has lost a seat or 2 in recent times. But those are then redrawn into districts to the person. So right now we have 17 congressional districts, and they have to be even. And then the same kind of thing happens with the House and Senate, but they don't have to be as exactly even. We have 203 House districts, we have 50 Senate districts, and they all are divided relatively equally across the state.
Now, why have some congressional maps been very irregular in shape in recent years? And we know there's a reason for that.
Oh, yeah, and it's not just our congressional. When we started looking at this, we were very concerned about our congressional map because we had some of the most distorted districts in the country. And the word people may have heard, I hadn't heard it until just before I got involved in this, was gerrymandering, which means drawing district maps to protect or to benefit a person or a party. And the word comes from Governor Elbridge Gerry of 1812 in Massachusetts. He was the governor. He signed off on a map, a bill, that gave an advantage to his party, which was the Democratic Republicans, which I find amusing. It's not the Democrats, not the Republicans, the Democratic Republicans. But there was a particular district that looked like a salamander. And so the press had a field day with that, and they took his name, the salamander. They called it gerrymander. But gerrymandering is simply drawing districts to benefit a person or a party. And after the 2011-2012 redistricting here in Pennsylvania, we had some of the most distorted districts in the country. There was one, Congressional District 7, which divided Montgomery County into 5 different districts, and that district went from Montgomery County to Delaware County to Chester County to Lancaster County, and ended up in Reading. And so very disparate pieces of 5 different counties, and drawn in a way that nobody in any of those counties had a say in who was elected. That was a very safe district for one person. And there were some similar districts drawn. That was a Republican legislator, a congressperson, but there were some other districts drawn for Democratic congresspeople in the same way, very gerrymandered. But that particular map gave 13 seats to the Republicans, 5 seats to the Democrats, even when they were pretty evenly balanced in terms of party registration. I do want to say, though, we started looking very much at that map. When we got into it more deeply, we said the same thing is going on with our state House and state Senate. In 2018, the Pennsylvania House map was the most distorted in the country in regard to how many votes were cast and how many seats won. We were 50% more skewed than the next 2 states. So we were not aware that it was as bad as it was, but it was bad.
Now, I understand why a major party would want to find as many voters as possible and then round them up, so to speak, and get them in the same district. But how do they hunt down, how do they target those voters anyway? Is that public information at someone's fingertips and then you can draw your map accordingly?
Well, what's really interesting is gerrymandering's been going on a long time. It actually predates Elbridge Gerry in 1812. I believe the first gerrymander in Pennsylvania was back in the late 1700s. But the technology has improved over the years. The ability to map precisely, the ability to gather data has improved. So the 2010, 2011, 2012 cycle was really kind of the hallmark of this, of new mapping technologies, new data mining technologies, information about people that was just gathered and stored, so much information, and all of that was used in that map. What's been interesting since then, though,
so technology has made it easier to find these voters.
Much easier. So if you look at Pennsylvania's district maps, that Congressional District 7 that I mentioned, you can see it kind of morphing over the decades. You know, it starts out very compact, a nice, reasonable district, and then it kind of gets some weird little tentacles, and then the tentacles get longer, and then the map that I'm describing from 2011, 2012 was just very bizarre. Somebody called it spin art. Somebody else called it goofy kicking Donald. It just was ridiculously.
That's what the silhouette suggested.
That's what the silhouette suggested. But it kind of just a rambling, weird. And some places it was as narrow as a parking lot. There's 2 spots, one in Montgomery County, one in Chester County, that was as narrow as a parking lot, and then it would widen out again. And that was because, very precise selecting of voters and dividing communities in an area that's very purple. So in a place where they could have had 3 relatively competitive districts, instead there were 3 safe Republican districts, drawn very, very precisely, and then packing Democrats into that one kind of weird one for a Democratic congressperson. So the technology has enabled extreme gerrymandering, and we're seeing litigation. There was litigation here in Pennsylvania in 2018. League of Women Voters and the Public Interest Law Center brought a lawsuit against our congressional map. Our state Supreme Court found that map was unlawful because our state constitution promises us free and equal elections. Equal is important. When you have gerrymandered districts, they are no longer equal. Some people's votes count more, some people's votes don't count at all. And so that court said that the map had to be redrawn. It was redrawn. And the subsequent map yielded, interestingly, 9 Republican and 9 Democratic seats. Went from 13-5 to 9-9. Now that map is no longer in use because we lost a seat in the last census. But the new map yielded 9 Democratic, 8 Republican.
Is this the map that the court created?
Well, the map the 2018 map was drawn by a special master. Right. And that was in place in 2018 and 2020. The new map we have a new congressional map that was just redrawn in 2021.
Special master meaning not the original commission.
Right. Special master is a mapping expert who's hired by the court.
Hired by the court.
Impartial person hired by the court to deliver a new map. So that happened as a result of the lawsuit in 2018. But we do have another new map now because we've had a new redistricting since, and the court got involved in that too. Because that map, the state legislature did not pass a map as a bill that the governor would approve. They passed a map that the governor said, this is not what I asked for, a transparent process and a map that represents communities well. He vetoed it, and then there was the potential of using we couldn't use the old map because there were 18 districts.
Right.
Had to be a new map, and so there was some appeals to the court. We need a new map. We need it fast.
And how did the court handle it this time as opposed to 2018?
The court handled it in a really interesting way. I don't know that this has been done anywhere. The court had the map that had been proposed by the state legislature. The governor then proposed his own map. And then a number of organizations introduced. I was actually had the fun of being on a group with the League of Women Voters, Common Cause Pennsylvania, Fair Districts PA, went together in drawing a map that was submitted. There were some other organizations that submitted map. One of the maps that was submitted was done by Committee of 70, had a project called Draw the Lines, where they ran a lot of mapping competitions. They took the best of those and submitted a map. So there were 13 maps in all that were submitted. The House Republicans, the House Democrats. I mean, there got to be quite a lot of maps. And then the
because
court...
people have more technology at their fingertips and they can do it.
People can now do that. People now have the technology. They can draw the maps. They can compare the maps. There's some wonderful websites that have been created to allow people to analyze maps. And so those were submitted, lots of expert testimony given, and the court, I believe, chose a very fair map, but also one that reflected the least change from the previous map. So it didn't disrupt a lot. It provided a reasonable map with a number of competitive districts and reflects Pennsylvania well.
Now, before we go any farther, Carol, let's consider the consequences of this practice of gerrymandering and redistricting in such a way, for example, if I'm in major party X and I manage to draw a district map that has all my voters in it, I'm content. Talk about the consequences, however, for the democracy.
Well, the consequences are pretty awful. So if you're in a district that has been safely drawn for a legislator, they don't have to pay attention to constituents. And I was in one of those districts. I was not in District 7. I was in the district right next to it, District 6. But the legislators in those districts, and most of the congressional districts in the last decade were like that, were very, very carefully drawn so that my vote didn't matter, your vote didn't matter. Nobody's votes matter because they had already decided who was going to win. The incumbent was going to win. They had decided which party would be in control. The party leaders didn't have to pay attention to the voters. Democracy is done. You are not heard. Your concerns are not reflected in any policy that's enacted. And that was true with the congressional map, but we've also seen it kind of play out at the state legislative level. If you've watched, you've probably noticed that many things that Pennsylvanians agree on never get put into law. And that's really what drew me into this. I got involved with the League of Women Voters because I had been following school funding and was puzzled, alarmed, wondering. There are people who've been advocating for a better school funding model for decades. People from both parties, people across the state have been saying, please fix this, and it doesn't ever change. And when I began to ask about it, I was put in touch with some folks who said, Carol, it's gerrymandering. And I said, I don't even know what that word means. I had some wonderful conversations with a state representative from Monroe County, a Republican, who had run on the issue of school funding, but had quickly begun to think about gerrymandering and redistricting, and had quite a few conversations where he explained, look, if you don't have representation, you can't fix the things that matter. This is a thing that matters. It won't get fixed until we fix redistricting.
And again, before we go any farther, Carol, it's good to keep the nomenclature straight in our minds. In other words, there's a difference between redistricting and reapportionment. Tell us.
Reapportionment is what Congress does after the census. I mentioned there's 435 congressional seats. They have to be divided across the country. So if some states are growing in population, they need more seats. If some states are losing population, they lose seats. Pennsylvania hasn't really lost population, but we've lost population relative to the states that are growing. So Pennsylvania has lost seats over the last couple decades. That's reapportionment. Redistricting is, you know how many seats you have. Now you divide.
Now let's make it work.
You divide the population across those seats, across those opportunities to divide into districts that are relatively even in population. That's the real important thing, is that they're relatively even in population, so everybody's vote is relatively equal.
So let's bring the redistricting debate up to date here, because there's been some activity in the State House recently, and it concerns House Bill 1776, which creates an independent redistricting commission, and that seems on the face of it to be in stark contrast to what we have right now.
Yes, absolutely. Most countries don't allow the people who are elected from districts to have any say in drawing those districts. It's a huge conflict of interest. Most countries don't allow partisan people to draw the districts, because you're going to draw them for your party. It's kind of like letting a football team be the ones to hire the coach, draw the field, call the outs. It doesn't work. You've got to have clear rules. You've got to have impartial judges, and you need somebody other than the legislators themselves, the party leaders, to be drawing those district maps.
Who's on the panel right now? Legislators, significantly, of course. Who else?
Well, so the Legislative Reapportionment Commission, it's misnamed, but the current LRC, the Legislative Reapportionment Commission, that draws our state House and Senate lines, that's the majority leaders and minority leaders from House and Senate, and that fifth person. So the most powerful legislators in both parties are the ones drawing the maps. They're drawing them to protect themselves. They're doing their best to give their party an advantage. They're also using them to give safe districts to their favored colleagues. They've been known, some of them have been known to tell their colleagues, you vote the way I tell you or we'll draw you off the map. I mean, those district lines give great power to the people who are drawing those lines. And then for congressional, it's a bill, but the party that's in control has complete control. And that really awful map, one party had control of both chambers and the governor's office, and drew those maps and told their colleagues to vote for them without many of the colleagues even seeing what the maps were. And when they saw it, they were appalled that they had voted for something that was so bizarre. The vote was very late in session. There was not much public awareness. There was not much awareness from the legislators, and it's easy to get away with things when you're in charge and you control the agenda and you control the district lines.
Carol, you said that lawmakers then are dominating the panel currently.
Completely.
That there are four people. It's the fifth person that's got me intrigued. Who is that person? It seems like they would have their hands full dealing with the major parties represented by the other four people.
Well, this time was pretty interesting. Mark Nordenberg, who is a law professor, chancellor from Carnegie Mellon, I believe it was Carnegie.
Out Pittsburgh way, anyway.
Yeah, I believe it might be University of Pittsburgh. From Pittsburgh, anyhow, he had been proposed by Republican legislators in the past. The Democrats had always said no. This time around, the Supreme Court, remember the four leaders, were not able to agree. The Supreme Court said, why don't we select Mark Nordenberg? And the court voted unanimously to have Mark Nordenberg be the chair. I believe he was very fair. He certainly, we advocated to use some rules and criteria that Fair Districts PA had proposed in the past. It wasn't put into law, but he took those suggestions, had lots of public meetings, had a website where the public could submit maps. Fair Districts PA submitted our own people's maps and gave testimony on those maps. There was much more transparency, much more public process. In the end, though, the decisions are made by legislators behind closed doors.
Right.
They do vote. You see the vote, but you don't see the negotiations. You don't see the discussions. You don't see, whose lines are we protecting? Whose lines are we not? And some of those for the House and especially the Senate. If you look at the Senate map, you think that doesn't benefit this community. That benefits that legislator. There was a lot of what we call buddy mandering, which is district lines drawn to protect legislators, incumbents on both sides. It's a kind of a handshake between the two. And the Senate map in particular has quite a lot of buddy mandering going on in it, and doesn't necessarily benefit communities well.
So let's dig into the details as much as possible about this Independent Redistricting Commission. Again, that's House Bill 1776. It was just recently introduced. So what kind of people are on this commission in the event this goes through and becomes law?
Yeah, and it's not, so the commission would be 11 people, 4 from each major party, 3 unaffiliated or third
So
party.
right away I'm noticing that's a larger commission than what we have presently.
It's a larger commission, so that you get some representation across the state. We've had commissions where all the commissioners are from one part of the state. This last commission, 3 of the 5 commissioners were from the Pittsburgh area, but we've had commissions where 4 of the 5 commissioners have been from the Pittsburgh area. This would be demographically and geographically more diverse, and give an equal seat to the major parties, and then a substantial voice to third party and unaffiliated voters. So that would be one piece. Those would be people who would apply. They would be vetted to see, do they have connections to the parties? You know, are they staffers for a particular party? They wouldn't be allowed to do any of that.
If you work for a lawmaker, you're out.
Yeah. So there'd be some prohibitions on who those people could be, and then they would be chosen through a process that would be mostly random. So it's not like anybody's choosing their favorite person. The leaders would be allowed to strike a few from each pool of candidates. So if the leaders said, I know who this person is, and I know they're not going to be fair, they could be stricken, kind of like a jury. So the idea is to have just people who have no vested interest in the process, who want to do it and want to do it well, and a fairly diverse group that can kind of represent all parts of the state. But that's only one part of the protection in this. Another part of the protection in this is a really transparent public process, so that there's a website where people can see the same data that the legislators are using. They can use mapping tools to submit their own maps. They can analyze maps that are proposed. There's public meetings, so people can show up and say, can you not draw this district that goes across the Susquehanna River in a place where there's no bridges, which has been the case.
So this transparency you speak of, is this just a goal, or is this part of the legislation?
This is built into the bill. It would be part of the bill. It would require 8 meetings before a maps are drawn, 8 meetings after. Half of those meetings would have to be in Pennsylvania's largest cities, so that people have a chance to come and speak. And then you know, the public website, public platform would be required. And then so that's a protection. A third protection is prioritized criteria. So spelling out in more detail, they do, you know, this is the amount of population deviation allowed between the districts. You know, it needs to allow minority voters an equal say in having candidates of their choice. You can't split a county more than mathematically necessary +1 for Congress, and for state Senate +2 for the House. So you can't sliver particular counties, and that's what we've seen. Particularly purple counties, you know, counties that have voters of different kinds, they tend to get carved up into little slices to keep this person there and this person there. So there's prohibitions against that, that they need to be compact. They need to recognize geographic boundaries as much as possible. I mean, we've got districts that go across ridges. You can't get from this side to the other side without going through 3 other districts. So much more clear, prioritized criteria. So there's 3 protections built in. You know, it's the independence of the commission, it's the transparency and the public process, and then it's the prioritized criteria.
Now, who has the job of appointing the people to this new proposed commission?
Well, as it's set up, as it's proposed, the Secretary of State, the Department of State would oversee it, but people are submitting, they're being vetted. We also have a role for the Ethics Commission in this. They're supposed to be overseeing an ethical state government, and so they would be helping to vet the candidates, and they would be doing a little bit of the selection to round out the diversity. We know this is a work in progress. We're kind of expecting to hear feedback on, does this work, does it not work? We're looking forward to hearing that feedback. The bills we've supported in the past were completely random selection, which we think would also work. Interestingly, there's, you know, when you talk in Pennsylvania, where is a impartial party that you would allow to do the selection. Pennsylvania is so partisan at the moment, no one can even imagine an impartial entity that could do selection. We're waiting to continue that conversation, but right now it's primarily random selection.
So this development in the House then really represents some progress for reforming redistricting, changing that policy anyway, hopefully for the better. Is there anything going on in the Senate that is parallel to this?
Yes, there's the same bill in the Senate. It might have a few little changes because, of course, the introducing prime sponsors, look at it and say, let's tweak it a little bit. But pretty much the same bill is considered in the Senate. In the House, it's Representatives Steve Samuelson, Representative Mark Gillen. Steve Samuelson is from the Lehigh Valley. He's been working on this for a long time. Mark Gillen from Berks County has also been very concerned about gerrymandering, one a Democrat, one a Republican. In the Senate right now, Senators Tim Kearney from Delaware County, which is one of those counties that was badly chopped up. I believe his district was part of that awful Congressional District 7. I think he was in part of that. So he's working on introducing a similar or the same bill in the Senate. And that would be Senate Bill 1076.
Now, often changing our legislation, changing the laws is a slow and deliberate process, as it should be. And in this case, it involves amending our state constitution, right? And how long would that take?
To amend the state constitution, you have to have a bill passed in 2 consecutive sessions with the exact same language, and then it goes to public referendum. That is time-consuming.
So this can span a year or 2.
It will have to span 2 legislative sessions. So that's more than 2 years for sure. Yeah, which is why we're starting this conversation now. The next redistricting will take place in 2031. The next census is in 2030. This needs to get passed before then.
Last question, Carol. I was looking at your website, and it suggests a script for pitching the idea of a new redistricting panel, which is what we've been talking about. And in the last minute of our show, would you summarize that phone pitch and make it as accessible and understandable to our viewers as you can? Sure.
So I would say fairdistrictspa.com is our website, and we have a page on there, Contact Your Legislator. We've also got a page, Advocacy Action, for this particular bill. And the argument is we need a process that is fair for everybody, no matter who's in charge. Because right now, if one party is in charge, the other party is going to get gerrymandered. And we don't think it's appropriate for either party to get gerrymandered. We want districts that represent communities well. We want this to get done soon. And we believe it's in the best interest of all Pennsylvania voters and all Pennsylvania legislators to get this amendment passed.
Carol Kuniholm, Chair of Fair Districts Pennsylvania, thank you.
Thank you.